Our second lesson today comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verses 40 to 56. Listen now for these words of God. On his return, Jesus was welcomed by the crowd, for they were all there waiting for him. And suddenly there came a man named Jairus, who was a leader of the synagogue. He fell at Jesus' feet and pleaded with him to come to his house because he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, who was dying. And the crowds were almost stifling Jesus as he went. Now there was a woman suffering from a hemorrhage for the past 12 years, whom no one had been able to cure. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, and the hemorrhage stopped at that very instant. Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, it is the crowds around you pushing." But Jesus said, "Somebody touched me. I felt that power had gone out from me." Seeing herself discovered, the woman came forward, trembling, and falling at his feet, explained in front of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been cured at that very moment. "My daughter," Jesus said, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, someone arrived from the house of the leader of the synagogue to say, "Your daughter has died. Do not trouble the master any further." But Jesus heard this and spoke to the man, "Do not be afraid. Only have faith, and she will be saved." When he came to the house, he allowed no one to go in with him except Peter and John and James and the child's father and mother. They were all crying and mourning for her, but Jesus said, "Stop crying. She's not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand himself, he spoke to her, "Child, get up." And her spirit returned, and she got up at that very moment. Then he told them to give her something to eat, and her parents were astonished. But he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. This is the word of the Lord. In exploring life beyond in this fall, and particularly these last few weeks, as I've been thinking a little bit about healing, my mind has been on the notion of hope. Any conversation about healing in our modern context is ultimately a conversation about hope. Hope is the stock and trade of modern medicine. This is where many of us turn when we are in need of healing, and when what we really want is to hear, "We can fix this. There is hope for your future. Things will return to normal." Hope is the wonder drug, the new experimental treatment, the brilliant surgeon, the heroic life-saving measures. It's all the things that promise to restore us, returning life to its intended track so that we can go back to whatever it was we were doing before things went off the rails. But what do we do when hope fails us? Because let's face it, there comes a time when things just aren't going back to the way that they were. Sometimes our lives go off the rails and they keep on going. This isn't just about our physical bodies. Our relationships, our careers, our finances, our plans for our future selves can all begin to break down and be in need of some kind of healing. And if what we're really looking for in these moments is hope, how do our spirits survive? How do we go on when the healing we seek does not meet our expectations, when our hopes are not realized? The women in this story from Luke's gospel have experience of unrealized hope. When Jesus encounters them, each is at a point where all hope seems to have vanished. One is young, just beginning her life, with so much untapped potential. The other is older and further along her journey, with so many years behind her spent outcast from her community. There is a sense of desperation in both the nameless woman and in Jairus, the father of the dying young girl. But Jesus sensed something else, first in the nameless woman. He senses trust. Trust in him. This trust went beyond all reason. It was a trust so deep that she was willing to take bold and potentially disastrous action. She was unclean. She was an outcast. She had been told that there was no cure for what ailed her. Yet she pushed through the crowd and reached out to touch the hem of Jesus' cloak. Perhaps it was this unexpected encounter with the woman that inspired Jesus to encourage Jairus in his own wavering belief. You see, unlike the nameless woman who had little left to lose as she reached out for Jesus' help, Jairus risked everything to come to this man who was known for his supernatural abilities. You see, Jairus was the leader of the synagogue. And this was the man who had opposed their rules and challenged their authority. Yet he came to Jesus to beg for help for his dying child. And just as he drew near to Christ, he received word that all was lost. Those who know Italian may recognize the words on the front of this morning's bulletin. They translate to, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." These are the famed words written above the gates of hell in Dante's classical poem, The Divine Comedy. And it's easy for us to hear these words as a warning or a curse, because we often think that the only possibility when hope disappears is utter desolation. Hopeless is a word we use to describe the worst possible scenario, a terminal diagnosis, the end of a relationship, 12 years cut off from family and worship in social and spiritual isolation, or a young, only child on her deathbed. This is what Dante intended for those words in his vision of hell, as a place defined by unending, unimaginable suffering. When all seems lost, when we are ready to give up, when fear and doubt and defeat threaten to overwhelm us and all hope is gone, desolation and despair may seem to us like the only option. But this is not the message of the gospel. Jesus reveals something different in this tale of two women. Faith. Faith is what he saw in the action of the nameless woman reaching for his cloak. Faith is what we see in Jairus when he steps outside the bounds of his religious constraints and duties to plead for his daughter's life. Faith works outside the duality of hope and despair that rules this human life. We might be used to thinking of hope and faith as similar, even interchangeable words, but their definitions are actually quite different. Hope is defined as a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen. Hope is about what we want, what we have planned, what we expect from a particular situation. As Martin Luther once described it, hope rests in our own will and relies on our own ability. Faith is something else entirely. It is defined as complete trust or confidence in someone or something. Faith is the light we walk by when we can see no other way forward. It does not answer all of our questions. It does not promise a return to normal. It does not long for the past or anticipate the future. It is the still, small voice of God that speaks to us within the chaos of right now, saying to us, "Fear not." This cancer very well may kill you. Fear not. You may never be the same after that accident. Fear not. She's left you, and she isn't coming back. Fear not. The stories of these two women in Luke do not offer the expected hope of our modern understanding of healing. Instead, they open our eyes to the life-altering transformation of faith. And I'm not talking about a what a friend we have in Jesus kind of faith that is comfortable and soothing. This is more like a Jacob wrestling with God until daybreak kind of faith. It is hard won. It is this kind of faith and not hope that draws Christ towards the two women in this story. And it is through this faith that their lives are restored. In the spring of 2000, Penn was diagnosed with breast cancer. 2 months earlier, Penn's dear friend Nancy had received word that her cancer, which had been in remission for 5 years, had returned. This time, it had spread. Nancy came from a family of cancer survivors. Of the 5 sisters and 1 brother in her immediate family, all but one had been diagnosed with some form of life-threatening cancer. One sister had died of breast cancer years before in her early 30s. Another had a tennis ball-sized malignant mass removed and was mercifully now cancer-free. The rest, including Nancy, were in some stage of remission. This was a road that Nancy knew well. She had beaten this thing before, and she would do it again. Penn was not so sure of things. For Penn, everything was new and uncertain. Her diagnosis was daunting. Stage 3. Nancy stood by Penn's side as she prepared to share the news with her husband and teenage children. "We'll get through this, Penn," she promised. As the two women both prepared for surgery, then radiation, then chemotherapy, Nancy decided that she and Penn should walk the journey of their illness together, the rookie and the veteran. Together, they sat through hours of chemotherapy treatments. They shaved one another's heads as each woman's hair began to fall out. They tried on wigs together and brought each other soup when their treatments made them weak and nauseous. They prayed for each other. Weeks and months went by. Penn got better. Nancy got worse. By the time Penn went for her 6-month post-op exam, when her cancer was declared in remission, Nancy was close to death. "We still prayed for each other every single day, right to the very end," Penn said later. "And you know what? I envied her. Even as her circumstance became more and more hopeless, she was in so much pain. And at a certain point, she lost hope that she would get better. But her faith never wavered. Mine certainly did. We cried a lot. We were mad a lot. But she never said, 'I think we can stop praying now. It's not working.' She would pray things like, 'Give me peace, O God. Let my heart fill with gratitude.' Sure, her prayers changed as she came close to the end, but they never, ever stopped. Faith has the power to transform us even when hope has failed us. The ancient psalmists prayed. We heard one of their prayers this morning as Jules read. In joy and sorrow, they cried out to God. Their prayers may have changed as their fortunes as a people waxed and waned, but they never stopped crying out to God. Even as they were clearly saying, "My God, I cannot feel your presence right now. I do not know if you are listening," still, each morning, they cried out to God. They did not lose faith. For when we lose faith, crying out to God becomes pointless. But when we abandon hope, when we let go of our own will and begin to trust something bigger, it is at that very moment, always, that we are prepared for transformation. That is the place where miracles happen. That is the point where life beyond healing begins. Though the miracle we receive or the restoration that comes to us may not be what we wanted or expected, transformation can move our lives in ways we never thought possible. Exhausted, and with only the few provisions that had washed ashore with him, the sole survivor of a shipwreck sat in despair on an isolated island. Each day he would scan the horizon, searching for any sign of salvation, but there was no hope in sight. One afternoon, he spied a ship far out at sea. He watched it for hours as it went across the horizon. And finally, he lit a torch to try to signal the ship and ran toward the shore, waving the small light frantically in the gathering darkness along the water's edge, but with no success. The ship passed along at a distance and vanished out of sight. As he attempted to signal the ship, however, the unthinkable began to happen. Stray embers from his torch landed in the fronds of his makeshift hut, catching it on fire. Before long, the shelter, his small cache of food, and all of his supplies were engulfed in flames, the smoke rolling up to the sky. He watched, stunned, as all that stood between him and death was destroyed. The man collapsed onto the sand, overcome with grief and anger and loss, knowing that this was the end and certain that he would perish alone on this beach. Several hours later, he awakened to the sound of a ship approaching the island, and he saw the crew sending out a small boat toward the shore to retrieve him. Once on board the ship, the grateful man asked his rescuers, "What brought you here? How did you know to come for me?" "We saw the smoke of your signal fire," they replied. Sometimes the very thing that looks like disaster brings about our salvation. Sometimes our plans and expectations and hopes fail us, and we are at the point of descending into despair. In those moments, there is another way, the way of faith. In the midst of the chaos, if we are able to abandon hope, we might yet hear the still small voice of God whispering, "I am here. I am here. I am even here. Fear not." Amen.